Hey, hello and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman and I'll be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type out your question. Now, with no further ado, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. Lots going on in Israel. I know lots going on in the US at the moment, but I'm going to focus on Israel for the next half an hour. Since last we spoke, which has been at least 2 weeks, 2 weeks is a long time. In Israeli politics, 2 days is a long time. We've gone for the fourth elections as predicted in a year and a half. So the first question we have to answer is how we got here. We've been talking for quite a while about these exit points that Prime Minister Netanyahu purposely put into the coalition agreement, or rather left out of the coalition agreement, that if a budget isn't passed in a certain amount of time, elections are called without Netanyahu having to give over Prime Minister's office to Benny Gantz, which is a requirement for all other situations. Basically, we got to a situation where there were threats, and certainly Netanyahu wanted elections, but he didn't want elections so soon. In fact, nor did Gantz. But we got to a situation, remarkably, where the decision was taken out of both of their hands. Netanyahu no longer had a majority to prevent the elections from basically being called. There was all these last-ditch attempts to try and work out some negotiations. Some believe there was never a real intention to do so, but what there was to try and delay it at least a few days to try and hammer out something. Netanyahu wants elections, but he wanted it later. Gantz doesn't want elections because he's basically falling off the political map. From a party in the last elections that got into the mid-30s, they are now polling at 5, and there's been a whole host of defections from Blue and White. Basically, out of the original, I believe, 35 or 36 they received, there's only, I believe, 5 or 6 people left in Blue and White. Obviously, we know Yesh Atid left Blue and White, or rather, Benny Gantz left Yesh Atid out in the cold when he joined the government. But there's been many high-profile defections. Avi Nissenkorn, the justice minister, left to form a new party with Tel Aviv Mayor Ron Chodai. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And quite a few other people are either retiring from politics or have left to seek places in other lists. But the reason Netanyahu didn't want it when it was is because what I'm sure everybody has seen in the media is a very successful vaccination program. Israel leads the world, and we're being told this every single day. I think about 15 to 16% of the population have already been vaccinated. It is a tremendous success, and Prime Minister Netanyahu deserves certainly a lot of credit for that. But Netanyahu wanted, at the moment, elections are scheduled for March 27th because according to the quasi-constitution that we have in Israel, when elections are called because of a lack of a budget, then they have to be 3 months to the day. So there was no discussions about the date, which they usually are. If there would have been an agreement of dispersal at Knesset, there's even a 3 to 4 month window where there could be some negotiations as to where the elections are held. But because it's March 27th, that's quite early. And it's possible that the vaccination program won't have finished by then. It's very possible that it will be close to being finished. And will that give enough time for Netanyahu to really, show that the country is over coronavirus? He keeps on talking about we will be the first country, or one of the first countries in the world, to be beyond coronavirus, something which is certainly looking good at this point. But there's a feeling that March was a little bit too soon. He would have preferred April or even May, where the economy could have got back on course by then. But basically, so that's why we're at elections. The interesting thing about this is we really see a shake-up of the blocs, and the biggest, not wholly unexpected, but certainly biggest surprise of these elections was the defection or the leaving of Gideon Saar from his political home for quite a number of years. He was always seen as a candidate to take over from Netanyahu. Once Netanyahu would step aside, he was one of the greater threats to Netanyahu, as Netanyahu showed earlier last year when there was a contest between the two of them for the leadership in the Likud. Netanyahu basically won 3/4 of the vote, which was higher than most expected. I expected it to be a little bit closer, but Likud voters, especially the committee members, are very loyal to leaders. They've never replaced a leader in the history of the movement, the political movement. But the fact is that Gideon Sa'ar left, and immediately he became a lightning rod for all sorts of those who are just disappointed with Netanyahu, whether from the right, center, or left. And what we've seen is that he is polling at the moment between, I think the first time he got 22, now he's polling a little bit lower than that. But what we do see, what's really interesting is that, and I saw this for the first time the other day, is now when commentators are putting up maps of the potential seats, it used to be right, left, perhaps center. In recent year or two, since the first of these ongoing elections, they used to leave Lieberman out. There was a right-wing bloc, a right-wing religious bloc, a left-center bloc, and then there was Lieberman. What they're doing now is they're having those who are part of Netanyahu's bloc, which is basically Likud and the two ultra-Orthodox parties. And then we see those who have specifically said we will not sit with Netanyahu, which is everybody else except Naftali Bennett. Naftali Bennett has been extremely careful, the leader of Yamina, which is polling between 13 and 15, depending on the poll. He basically took a great hit when Gideon Sa'ar left because started his own party, because as we know, Naftali Bennett was really seen as the alternative to Netanyahu and was receiving even support from the left because they saw him as an alternative, the only serious alternative to Netanyahu, also because he spoke very clearly about how to get out of the coronavirus situation and get the economy working quickly, which is obviously a big issue here. But when Sa'ar entered the race, he really took his numbers down by at least a third, if not more. But he's still polling pretty well. But he has said specifically he will not rule out sitting with Netanyahu. In fact, about a week, maybe a little bit more, Naftali Bennett held a press conference, which was live on all the major news channels, where he said, I see myself as a candidate for the Prime Minister's office, which is a very clever move. First of all, it puts him front and center, but also it means the question that will be asked whether he will suggest or recommend to the president after the elections, whether he recommends Prime Minister Netanyahu to form a coalition. When that question is asked, as it is asked daily of every person, every politician, leader of a party, he can say, I will recommend myself. So he can evade the question of whether he would recommend Netanyahu or not. But the point is that the major challenger at this point is Gideon Sa'ar. Gideon Sa'ar has said he will not sit in a Netanyahu-led government. He hasn't ruled out if Netanyahu will be a member of his government, or whether, certainly he would sit very happily with Likud, but he has said he will not sit with Netanyahu. But don't forget, we heard that from Gantz, and I can tell you in the Knesset, speaking to a lot of MKs from left, right, and center, a lot of the people don't think they can rely too much on those sort of statements, and they believe that if the time comes, just like Gantz did, who claimed for the longest time he will no way sit with Netanyahu, that Sa'ar would eventually sit with Netanyahu. Netanyahu said that he's not going to do another rotation, no matter what the situation. Again, once the issue of rotation is out there, once he's given it to one player, it's very hard for him to say, I'm never going to do it again, especially if the other side has a very strong hand. But what is very interesting, at the moment, Netanyahu's bloc, which, as I said, only is 3 parties, according to the most recent poll, is 43. Now, the magic numbers we all know is 61. Where does he get those other 18? Bennett is probably not going to get 18. I don't see it. So the only other real player left in is Sa'ar. So basically, Netanyahu knows that he probably needs So he certainly needs Bennett, and what we do see is Netanyahu taking a little bit of the pressure off Bennett. They used to attack each other regularly, but that was taken down a notch or two. So Saar is the main contender because they're going after the same votes, but there doesn't seem to be a way that Netanyahu could form a government without Gideon Saar. The question is whether Gideon Saar will hold true. If Gideon Saar does hold true to his word, he can probably go to Bennett, Lieberman, Lapid, or Chodai, and Gantz, perhaps. There's a question whether he'll pass the threshold. At the moment, he's teetering very, very close to the threshold, but together, according to the most recent poll, they would get over that number of 61. They are all adamantly anti-Bibi. They've all been burnt by him. They've all worked very closely with him. Lapid less so, but he certainly was. He was a finance minister in the government of Bibi. But all the others, again, probably apart from Chodai, are ideologically right-wing. They would sit comfortably with Likud, but they are just fed up personally with Netanyahu. The question is whether, first of all, these poll results actually happen on election night and whether they will hold their nerve, whether all these disparate parties can get together just for that one reason to get Netanyahu out, if that is their purpose, whether they can find common ground, whether they can divvy up all the different ministries that you need to do when there's a government. So that there's a lot in play at the moment, but those are basically the big issues of the elections are coronavirus and the economy. We're in our third lockdown. I believe we're one of the first nations in the world to go into a third lockdown. As of tomorrow night, it's going to be even stricter. There's a lot of anger out there. A lot of people are going to be losing their jobs. Small businesses are completely closed, have been closed already for 2 weeks. They're going to be closed for another 2 weeks. So there's a lot of anger. And don't forget, we've spoken about it in the past, that the bastion of Likud is lower socioeconomic people from the so-called periphery. These are the people going to be most targeted by any sort of layoffs or whatever it is. Yisrael Katz, the finance minister, and Prime Minister Netanyahu have talked about giving a lot of payments out to small businesses, to freelance workers, etc. But at the moment, they've been very slow to do so. For all their promises, an economist suggested in this morning's TV, they've given out about 5% in total of what they promised they would give out. So promises aren't necessarily worth a lot in the eyes of much of the general public. So these are the issues that will take center stage. But the big question which many voters will be asking themselves is, do I want Prime Minister Netanyahu to continue in his role? Next week is going to see the restart of his criminal case. He's going to have to appear in court. He's been trying to delay it as much as possible. One last hurdle seems to have been taken away from him. He tried to delay it further, and the court just ruled recently that they will not delay it further. So we're going to have to get used to seeing a prime minister relatively regularly, sitting in a Jerusalem district court, hearing all sorts of accusations from all sorts of witnesses. So that could play a role. But the vaccines, as I said, is a great success, and Netanyahu takes any opportunity to play it up, which he should do as a politician. Tomorrow, Moderna, the first Moderna vaccines are going to be arriving. I'm sure we'll have some sort of photo op with Netanyahu to try and make sure that the issue and the headlines are about the vaccines. But we're going to hear a lot more from all these issues over the next few weeks ahead of that March election date. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions on this or any other issues.
All right, thank you so much. So the first question we have in is, how do the Israelis see the normalization of relations between the Gulf states and Qatar?
Well, most Israelis won't be following this, but the analysts, some say that there could be a relation to Israel, and many argue that it will have nothing to do with Israel. There are those who believe that this could pave the way for Saudi-Israel normalization, because Qatar have, hold a great hand in the fact that they run the Al Jazeera international news network, media network, which is very powerful, especially in the Arab world. And Qatar have used that as leverage many times. And that was one of the reasons why many of the neighbors of Qatar, including Saudi Arabia and the UAE, basically have been boycotting Qatar for the last few years. But we've already seen Al Jazeera take a more moderate tone towards its neighbors in the last few days, which could signal a change with basically what the Qataris are telling Al Jazeera. So some say that could remove one of the big obstacles towards Saudi-Israel normalization, because that will take one of the big potential critics out of the table. My view is this has very little to do with Israel. This has got more to do with Joe Biden, President-elect Biden, the Iranian deal. Saudis know that under the Democratic administration, they're going to get a much harder time. They have a very close relationship to the Trump administration, and they know that they'll get a bit of a frosty reception. So they're trying to unify the forces in the region, especially as what's being seen as a potential attempt to rejoin the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. So I think that's what it's more about. Could there be it certainly helps Israel, the fact that Qatar is now back in. That's the sort of the Gulf Cooperation Council. But I don't necessarily think that this is the last hurdle between Israel and Saudi normalization.
Understood. So do most Israelis believe in the scientific and medical justification for the strong measures taken by the government to beat the coronavirus?
Interestingly enough, there was just a poll taken tonight, and it's a left-right divide. They usually take, how you self-identify. If you self-identify as right wing, then you tend to agree with this stricter lockdown. If you're left wing, then you're less likely to believe that this is just on medical, or let's say on epidemiological grounds, more political reasons. But on the whole, the public does believe that there is a reason to this. They see the numbers going up. Israel has a higher per capita number of cases every day than even the US at the moment, and we know things are not great in the US. So Israel's definitely, it's getting out of hand a little bit. We keep on talking about in Israel what we call the British mutation, basically, which seems to spread a lot quicker, and it's clear that is in Israel. They've been talking about now the South African mutation, which not only spreads quicker, they say is potentially more dangerous, especially for younger people, and they think that could also be in Israel. So there's definitely a need for some sort of measures. What's clear is that we wasted 2 weeks before the sort of half lockdown, which didn't achieve much except shutter many businesses. Perhaps they should have had the stricter lockdown 2 weeks ago, and maybe we'd be on our way out of it by now. But the numbers are certainly escalating and getting out of control. And for the first time, they say, I just read a report that there was a hospital that had to make a decision not to treat someone with COVID because they were just overstaffed. We heard reports from Italy right at the beginning of the coronavirus of that happening, but this is the first time it's happened in Israel. And that's certainly given a lot of people a lot of pause to reflect and understand that something needs to be done.
And have you guys had any cases of the new variant of COVID there?
As I said, yes, we do know that the British, they call it the British mutation. It's a lot less subtle than the London variant or whatever they're calling it elsewhere. Here they call it openly the British mutation, which makes me as a former English person very, very fascinated. But it's clear that there was a big worry about it, and there was a day when they understood that it was coming over, that basically they dragged everyone, not literally, off the plane from London and put them in Corona hotels. They've now closed those, but now today they've been ordered to be reopened, especially for South African visitors from South Africa or Israelis returning from South Africa. They say that probably where it spread the quickest, and the numbers certainly back that out, is in the ultra-Orthodox community. The ultra-Orthodox community is by far and away where it's spreading the quickest. I mean, if you just look at the numbers in ultra-Orthodox communities, up to 25% of people being tested are coming back with coronavirus, whereas in other areas like Tel Aviv, it's around 3%. So you see a massive disparity. We saw yesterday, very controversially, a massive wedding in one of the anti-Zionist ultra-Orthodox communities of 10,000 people. And there's a lot of anger about that. I mean, these things have been ongoing, but even more, which drove a lot of people to anger is the fact that police were there, but they refused to break it up. And there's a picture of a policeman going into the wedding and sort of, I would say bowing down, but certainly showing what some would argue is too much respect to some of the leading rabbis who were there. These pictures have been doing the rounds. Apparently the police office is now being investigated. They should have shut it down. So it's causing a lot of embarrassment. It's certainly something that Prime Minister Netanyahu could do without, because he has to remain loyal to the only parties loyal left to him, which is the ultra-Orthodox party. So he's left in a quandary. On the one hand, he has to shut down ultra-Orthodox areas. On the other hand, he can't be seen as singling them out, because that obviously wouldn't play out well with his political partners. And some have suggested, going back to the previous question, that some say, why is there a complete lockdown? Should there be a lockdown of only those areas with high concentration of coronavirus? And those happen to be ultra-Orthodox or Arab areas. And some say that we're going for a complete lockdown just so they won't be, singled out.
So one last question on this topic. There's been some criticism of Israel for not vaccinating the Palestinians through The Guardian. While the PA has its own Ministry of Health, what help has Israel provided?
It's not just The Guardian, NPR, Washington Post, and a few others all reported on this. First thing that should be noted is that according to the Oslo Accords, which were signed by Israel and the Palestinians and witnessed by the international community, the Palestinian Authority is in charge of their own healthcare. They have full autonomy on healthcare. In fact, in the agreement itself, and I checked it the other day just to make sure, the Palestinian Authority is in charge of all vaccinations. The Palestinian Authority has, in fact, even negotiated a deal with the Russians for the Sputnik vaccinations. They're also in the WHO program. There's a lot in the what used to be called Third World that certainly can't compete with some of the richer countries of acquiring vaccinations. So the WHO is buying a lot for the Third World or developing countries, and the Palestinian Authority is in that. The other thing that needs to be stated is the Palestinian Authority broke off relations at their own behest from Israel. So at the moment, there are no relations. And what is known is the Palestinian Authority has not made any official requests from Israel. But there are reports that dozens of vaccines were handed over to the Palestinian Authority by Israel yesterday. It's not known exactly who they're going to go to. But Health Minister Edelstein has said that he doesn't see any scenario where Israel won't eventually help the Palestinians because our communities are so integrated. So the Guardian headline was factually incorrect, and obviously was there for clickbait and to enrage and deflect. But the fact remains that the Palestinian health system is separate. They have their own obligations. They have their own autonomy. And Israel is looking after its citizens, and the Palestinian Authority should look after its citizens, which it's doing. As I said, it's ordered the Russian, and they think by the end of January or February, they should be getting millions of the Russian vaccine and probably many others. So they're in a better situation than many others around the world.
So if I'm understanding what you were saying earlier, Sa'ar would be able to form a coalition without Netanyahu, but Netanyahu wouldn't be able to form a coalition without Sa'ar?
That's the way it's looking at the moment. I mean, again, these are poll results. Everything could change in the next 2.5 months, even a little bit more than that. So these are just poll results. But if the poll results are relatively accurate, then yes, I mean, you never know with Netanyahu. He could be making these deals with other people. But if everyone who says that they won't sit with Netanyahu continues to say that, then yes, there is no way for Netanyahu to get to his 61 at the moment. Where Sa'ar, if he can bring in all these disparate groups together to sit under him, because he would be obviously the leader of the larger party, then he does have a route to the Prime Minister's office. Another possibility that we haven't spoken about is that we simply go to a 5th election, because no one will be able to form a government. That is a very possible scenario. Obviously, the Israeli public hopes not, but that will only we'll only know more about that once the election results are in and the process of negotiations begin.
So even with the successful vaccination program, with only 5% of the economic relief disbursements going out, how is that affecting the government right now, popularity-wise?
I mean, there's a few sides to it. The Likud is relatively stable, interestingly enough, because whereas on the one hand, yes, there are some who blame it for the economic side of it, but it's getting quite a lot of, good points for the vaccination program, which is undoubtedly a success. And we see it's far beyond anything any other country is doing. Blue and white has basically been decimated, as I said. It's gone down from, I think, 35, 36 in the last election, something like that. And now it's polling just over the threshold, 4 or 5 seats. The Haredi parties, the ultra-Orthodox parties have gone down a seat or 2, each of them, or Shas has gone down a seat or 2. But, when we're talking about a seat or 2, that can always be, one poll will say this and one poll will be that, but they're relatively stable. Maybe, Shas have lost a seat just because, they reach out beyond the ultra-Orthodox community itself. So that's basically the government. Everybody else has kind of left. Derech Eretz, Hauser Hendel have left. The Labour Party is pretty much not going to exist for the first time in the history of the state of Israel. At this point, it's not polling above the threshold. That's remarkable for the party which founded the state and ruled the state for the first almost 3 decades. That's quite a remarkable feat for Amir Peretz, basically, to take his party into irrelevance. And there's now a court case. He doesn't want to hold internal primaries. And basically, one of his challengers, Merav Michaeli, has taken him to court to hold primaries. And the court has basically sided with Michaeli on this. So the Labour Party is a mess, and it's almost certainly not going to run on its own. So a lot of these parties, by the way, may not end up. There's also Ofer Shelach, we haven't talked about. Yair Lapid's number 2. Pretty much throughout the whole history of Yesh Atid, he broke off. He's not polling above the electoral threshold, but it's suggested that he will probably end up in Meretz. It's possible Hodei will join with someone else. It's possible that there's a lot of permutations. Also, Yamina seems to be breaking up Bezalel Smotrich, as we said, on the more right-wing religious side of Yamina, the National Union Party. He's basically declared that he's forming a party called the Religious Zionist Party, because remarkably, in a poll the other day, they asked a question, how many people would vote for Yamina, and they showed the results, and they said, if Bezalel Smotrich left Yamina, how many people would vote for it? And they actually would raise by 2 seats. Usually you lose some seats if a big name leaves your party, but actually it seems to be, it would work for Yamina. So there are negotiations between Naftali Bennett and Bezalel Smotrich, but it seems like there's a possibility they could, diverge paths. And then the question is, some of these other smaller right-wing religious splinter parties, if they would come in, if they would go with Bennett, if they would go with Smotrich, lots of sort of combination permutation. So there's a lot still, until the lists are closed. There's a lot that could change this map. Let's just say not massively, because I think the major players are in. Isaac Kot, former chief of staff, was going to enter politics, and the big question was where he was going to join. But he's decided, and he was worth quite a few seats, according to polls, but he's decided he's not entering at this time. So I don't see any massive changes at this point. Tzipi Livni is another one who apparently could return for the, I don't know how many time, but I don't see the map changing massively. So it's just a matter of who can get those small amounts of numbers, because as we talked before, a swing of 2, 3 seats this way, that way can change the map. So there's going to be a lot of jockeying for position over the next few weeks.
Thank you. And for our last question of the day, what are the possible consequences of turmoil in DC to the Middle East and North Africa in terms of Israel's security?
The current turmoil, as far as what's going on today, I mean, I'm not following that so closely. It certainly is, it's uncomfortable to see some of these things. But my assumption is it will get sorted out. President-elect Biden will be sworn in. And that's really what Israel is looking ahead to, because it's certainly going to be a less comfortable 4 years ahead than it was the last 4 years. It'll be very much, in Israel, everybody's waiting. I say Israel at the highest levels, the one thing that they're waiting to see is what's going to happen with Iran. The Palestinian issue, nothing's happened for many decades. There'll be a greater emphasis on it. Maybe we'll see return to sort of the idea of linkage. Maybe we'll see a slightly more frosty relations. But the most worrying thing for Prime Minister Netanyahu and many people at that level in Israel is, what is President-elect Biden going to do with Iran and the JCPOA, whether he's going to return to it, what's going to be the relationship, because Iran, as we've seen, has been enriching over 20%, which is a real game changer. We've heard the condemnations. The question is whether the Americans are going to act, whether the Europeans are going to act, because at the moment, all we've heard is that there's an interest in the Biden administration returning America to the agreement. So that's really where a lot of the attention is going to be over the next few weeks. And that's where we are today, I think.
All right, well, thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar. Ashley, thank you again for taking time to update us this week. For our viewers, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar with Indies and the Needies on Can Greece Provide an Alternative to Turkey and U.S. Strategy? Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a great day and Happy New Year. Bye.